welcome to another video, and this one we're going to be taking a look at every Sorceress-themed ability in Path of Exile 2 that we know about so far. And to be clear, these abilities are themed around the Sorceress, so it's all about elemental damage, things that interact with elemental ailments, and also some abilities that interact with mana and energy shield as well. But in Path of Exile 2, just like in Path of Exile 1, you will of course be able to use these abilities on any class, not just the Sorceress. It's just the case that for the marketing of Path of Exile 2 and to make it a little bit clearer and easier to understand for newer players joining the franchise for the first time, they've kind of showcased all of the abilities so far as class abilities, which makes sense. But fear not, you can be a Firestorm warrior in PoE 2 if you really want to be. Now, all of the tooltips for these abilities have been captured across a bunch of footage from the LA event, and a few have come from older source material such as the ExileCon footage from last year. For most of the abilities, I have some gameplay footage showcasing the skill in action, but for some of the higher level abilities I couldn't find any footage, so I have to just make do with the tooltips for those. Let's get straight into it, beginning with Fireball. This skill looks very similar in PoE 2, but it's functionally different, as it will explode on contact to create a nova of small firebolts which will go out in all directions, making it quite good for clearing. It's also worth mentioning that Fireball was one of the showcased abilities which appeared as an implicit skill granted by a weapon in the ExileCon showcase, and Jonathan said that this version of the skill was free to cast. Next up we have Spark. This ability seems to be very similar to its PoE 1 counterpart. It fires off projectiles which appear to move in random directions and bounce off of terrain. During the ExileCon showcase, Jonathan mentioned the ability was being supported by Pierce support to make it better at clearing monsters. Arc is another lightning ability which appears to be very similar to its PoE 1 counterpart. The character fires off some lightning at a target enemy, and that lightning will then chain to other nearby enemies. Jonathan remarked that this skill is better for single target as it deals a lot more damage to the first target that it hits. Frostbolt is also very similar to its PoE 1 counterpart, with the major differences being that the projectiles travel along with chilled ground forming underneath it as it moves. And when the projectile collides with terrain, it will actually explode, dealing AoE cold damage, which will make this one very interesting as a clearing ability in some map layouts with lots of closed spaces. Next up, Ice Nova. This spell expands a hit of cold damage around the caster, which will also knock back enemies depending on how close they are to you. Ice Nova can be used on a moving Frostbolt projectile to expand the Ice Nova from that location instead, and doing this will empower the Nova, making it more likely to freeze. Cold Snap is another cold ability which interacts with Frostbolt projectiles as well. This skill can target a frozen enemy to cause them to shatter and explode for area cold damage, and you'll be able to use Cold Snap by targeting Frostbolt projectiles to make the ability shatter all of the frozen enemies in an area around the Frostbolt, which makes the combination of Frostbolt, Ice Nova and Cold Snap quite good as a clearing setup. Then we have Comet, another cold-themed ability. This one looks amazing. It has a really long cast time wind-up, and it will just drop a giant ice ball on the targeted area, dealing a lot of cold damage. And the casting animation for this skill will actually make the character move backwards a little bit, allowing for some repositioning counterplay. Barrier Invocation is an interesting one. This is one of the new meta skill gems, and it will reserve Spirit to grant a buff. The buff will charge an energy mechanic based on how much damage you take to your energy shield, up to a maximum threshold of energy. You can then use this skill again to consume the energy that has been built up to trigger the socketed spells. Something to note here is that in PoE 2, triggering abilities will work a bit differently, in that the cast time of the triggered ability will directly impact the triggering condition. So in the case of Barrier Invocation, it will use more of the stored energy to trigger a spell which has a longer cast time, compared to one with a shorter cast time. This will function similarly with Cast on Shock, another new meta skill gem, which will also build up energy as you shock enemies. Similar to Barrier Invocation, the amount of maximum energy that you can have is based on the cast time of the triggered ability, so it will take longer to build up energy required to trigger the skill if it has a longer cast time compared to a shorter one. Arctic Armour is another skill which reserves Spirit. This one will grant an icy barrier which builds up over time while stationary and falls off very quickly once you start moving. The buff will make you immune to freeze, and it will make you take less physical and fire damage per stage which has been built up while remaining stationary. Importantly, by the looks of it, in PoE 2 it seems that Arctic Armour's less damage taken for physical and fire damage will also apply to damage over time for those types as well, not just hits. Monsters hitting you while you have the buff will take cold damage, as long as the icy barrier has been built up and is active. Flame Wall appears to function exactly as it does in PoE 1, creating a ground-targeted wall of fire which deals fire damage over time to enemies standing in it. If any enemies enter the area, once it's active, they take extra fire damage over time from the secondary debuff, which can also be applied by shooting projectiles through the wall at enemies. And this will add some extra fire damage to the projectiles as well. One projectile ability that could be used with Flame Wall is Rolling Magma, which also appears to have very similar mechanics to its PoE 1 counterpart, creating a bouncing fiery orb which deals area damage each time it bounces. However, in PoE 2, this skill will also refresh the amount of bounces it has left when it passes through a flame wall. Next up we have Solar Orb. This skill creates a large fire orb at a location which periodically explodes for fire damage. Any enemies that are close enough to the orb will also take fire damage over time, but recasting the Solar Orb will actively replace the current orb. Flameblast is another returning classic from PoE 1, with a bit of a different spin in PoE 2. This channeling ability will build up stages to release an explosion around the caster, with higher stages transferring to a larger area and more damage. However, Flameblast can instead target an active Solar Orb to expand the blast from that location instead, for a more similar ranged playstyle to the one in PoE 1. Frostbomb will pulse in an area for its duration, applying cold exposure to nearby enemies. When the duration expires, the Frostbomb will explode, dealing a massive hit of cold damage. Mana Tempest is a spell which will boost your other abilities while you stand in its area. This ability will drain your mana while you remain in the storm, empowering your spells with added lightning damage and making lightning projectile and beam spells have added chains so that they can hit more enemies. The Mana Tempest area will disappear shortly after you leave it. Just like in PoE 1, Orb of Storms will create a stationary orb which periodically zaps nearby enemies. This damage can then split to other enemies in the area, and increasing your cast speed will have an impact on how often the Orb of Storm procs. Now, for the rest of the Sorceress-themed abilities, I unfortunately don't have footage of the ability in action, but I do have tooltips for most of them. Lightning Warp looks very interesting. It can be used to target enemies and teleport to them once they're within cold range. Upon teleporting to an enemy that can be cold, the enemy will explode for lightning damage in an area around them and create shocked ground. And this ability will also highlight enemies that are in cold range near you, and you can then use the ability to queue up several targeted teleports in sequence. Lightning Conduit can be used to strike a group of enemies in a cone shape in front of the caster. This hit of lightning damage will deal a lot more damage if the enemies were already shocked, but it will also remove the shock thereafter. Frost Wall will create an icy wall to prevent enemies from reaching you. The wall will explode if it takes enough damage, or if enough pressure is put on the wall from enemies moving in its direction. And when it explodes, it will deal AoE damage to enemies surrounding the broken areas of the wall. The Firestorm ability seems to be very similar to its PoE 1 counterpart. It's a duration-based fire spell which rains down fire at the targeted location, exploding on impact, dealing damage to enemies caught in the storm. Energy Remnants is a Sorceress-themed ability that we have no idea about. We only know about the name of this skill. I believe the icon is identical to PoE 1's Arcane Cloak, perhaps with some colour variation for more of an energy shield blue rather than a mana blue. So perhaps this skill will spend energy shield for a similar effect. Lastly, Raging Spirits is the SRS of PoE 2, and this one doesn't actually appear on the Sorceress skill list from the footage that I've seen, so it's possible that it's a witch-themed ability, though I feel like it's somewhere in the middle, with it being a minion skill which also procs by using fire spells. Regardless, in PoE 2, SRS will be a reservation skill which summons Raging Spirit minions whenever you use a fire spell, and the amount of spirits summoned can be increased by boosting the AoE of the fire spell that you're using, or by hitting more targets using projectile-based fire spells. And there you have it, all of the Sorceress-themed abilities in Path of Exile 2 that we know about thus far. Once again, keep in mind that these are just themes, and you will absolutely be able to use any or all of these abilities on any class that you like. The choice is yours. Thank you to my patrons for your ongoing support. If you'd like to join them and support my channel going forward, you can find all of the information about becoming a patron in the link in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.